I think there are educational systems, and I'm not saying that those alternative systems like Waldorf education are necessarily ideal, but there are alternative educational philosophies that understand each child is best served if they can develop at their own speed,
Mm-hmm.
rather than if you're 6 years old, you should be able to do this and this and this and this. And so that's kind of a institutional, I recognize, idea in American education. It's just not the mainstream. So in the mainstream, there there's just not as much room for saying, well, this person is in first grade and they're not able to talk yet. That's in the mainstream, that's a problem.
Mm.
Um, and there's not always any sort of wiggle room or flexibility for the school system to say, well, wait a minute, it could be a problem, but is it necessarily a problem for this particular
Mm-hmm.
child? And if it's not, then how can we manage this?
Mm-hmm.
Because in that system, the child has to be able to do certain things before they can go to the next grade. So you could have someone who's an absolute genius who fails 1 year and then they fail the next year, and then a few years later they are passed to the next grade and they end up being stigmatized because they're 2 years older than the other kids in that grade level. And suddenly in that year, let's say they start to blossom in terms of being able to talk or being able to do some of the other things that we're socially expected to be able to do. Well, we can accommodate people like that very well in our educational system, which is a shame because I think about all the human potential that might be lost because we can't. Um, when the other Another thing, when I was growing up, most disabled kids couldn't go to school.
Mm.
So we had children in my neighborhood, for example, they just they couldn't go to school because there were no resources in the schools for kids with certain kinds of severe disabilities, and they couldn't ride the bus. They needed someone to, let's say, be with them. Well, there was nobody who could be with them. And so you have a child who's disabled, who was my peer, for example, who they just stayed home all day, every day, and they never got to to go to school. And again, a tremendous waste of human potentials. And I'm sure that wasn't just in my neighborhood or my community. I'm sure that was happening in many parts of the of the South where um, Black families had disabled children.
I've got so many thoughts as I listen to you. I mean, and I might be overstepping here, but in a sense, when I hear you comparing the sort of Waldorf Steiner style of learning about rhythms and community and the pace of life and becoming a master of your own body and space with other people and those sorts of things. And then I think about the comparison with Western school by design, I sort of zoom right out to what are we trying to do? What are we trying to achieve with our children? And that we've gotten stuck in Western school systems in teaching proper behaviors. And I'm sort of joining these dots as you're speaking about how much of school by design is about social conditioning for that social contract, which it does grieve me because you're trying to create people that fit rather than trying to support the autonomy and agency of people so that you get to experience their unique genius.
Mhm.
So it's almost like we're talking about, that big word decolonization, but taking, what is it we need to peel away from the systems, from the paradigms that at the moment drive child development, education, human healthcare systems, all of those different pieces. Because in those first years of your life, it would be such a sadness for someone to have robbed you of some of those experiences you had communing with the world, I think.
It would have been tragic because had that happened, there's a good chance I may not be here because the importance of those early years were to, let's say, enable me to become rooted in, mm, do you know this term mana? MANA, mana. It's found in some uh, Eastern and Pacific Island um, spiritual belief systems. It really means the force of life that's in everything, if I can reduce it to a sentence. Well, those early years enable me to become grounded in mana and
Mm,
to, and to
wow.
establish my personal relationship with those forces of nature, the forces that are in objects that our Western thinking doesn't allow for. For example, time,
Mm,
my own relationship with time, which you can't really establish relationship with time if you're being guided by clocks. Clocks are human ways or mechanisms for trying to conquer time
yeah.
or to entrap time. But when I say time, I'm talking about something much larger than that. It was an opportunity to establish my relationship with space.
Mm,
And if you're if you start if you have a child who's going to preschool when they're 3 years old or 4 years old, their sense of space is going to be much different than if when they're 3 or 4 years old, they're simply engaged with wide open spaces defined by natural phenomena rather than enclosed spaces that are defined by human design.